In this clip, we're going to be looking at the essay topic, focusing on Athenian and Spartan tensions throughout the module. Now, this is a reasonably common question that's popped up quite a few times in past paper questions, but also in old specifications. And it's obviously one of the essay questions. So it's one of the 30-mark essay questions that you've got 45 minutes to complete. So remember, the exam is your modern historian debates. The 20-mark questions that you take about 30 minutes or so to answer. The blue essay questions, and you can agree and disagree with some of those, would take about 45 minutes to complete. And we're going to focus the revision today on a past paper question that's looking at the relations between Athens and Sparta being doomed from the moment that the Persians were defeated in 479. How far do you agree with this? And obviously the important thing is having structure, is having links to sources, and also source analysis points. Now, importantly, with the essay question, if no time frame is given, you do need to refer to the whole period. If there is a time frame, then obviously you need to stick to that. So for this question, you'd be focusing from 479 onwards. If no time frame was given in the question, you would need to refer a little bit to the Persian Wars. So you'd need to talk about the Athenians and the Spartans maybe working well together during the Persian Wars, as evidenced by the serpent column, but also potentially some examples of disagreement, particularly in the build-up to the Battle of Salamis between Eurybiades and Themistocles, as evidenced by Herodotus, or certainly in the build-up to Plataea, where there is some tension between the Spartans and the Athenians. If we stick to the time period from 479 onwards, though, what's a good essay structure going to look like? Well, we're going to need to deal with Themistocles and the refortification of Athens provided to us from Thucydides. We could absolutely refer to Pausanias' actions in Ionia and Aristides, his reputation, and that's from Diodorus, Plutarch, and Thucydides. Certainly the creation of the Delian League creates tensions and fear from Sparta towards the Athenians. Cimon's attitude towards Sparta as maybe we could potentially say as a period where Athenian-Spartan actions are actually, or relationships rather, are reasonably okay, but then that obviously collapses because of the Helot revolt and Cimon's exile. Certainly we'll need to talk a bit about the First Peloponnesian War and the tensions between Athens and Sparta. You could say culminate in the Battle of Tanagra in 457, and Pericles' is just general attitude towards the Spartans and towards a war with Sparta, absolutely. And then following Pericles' death, you could absolutely talk about key aspects of the Peloponnesian War. Crucially, we're going to be using Thucydides for big chunks of this, but also just be aware that it is worthwhile noting the lack of Spartan source material. Spartans were laconical, which means they didn't place much value on the written history, amongst other things. So we don't really have any Spartan source material. However, Thucydides is useful to us because of his exile. He could get the perspective of the Peloponnesians towards Athens and the war itself. Now, to make an introduction to this type of question, you could certainly discuss the growth of Athenian power and, as Thucydides tells us, the fear which this caused in Sparta. And certainly, again, Thucydides is a spectacularly useful source for us because of the way that he writes his history, because of the way that he checks his sources, and because he's very much living in this period. Particularly his exile makes this really, really, very, very useful. But we can use Thucydides for a far earlier event that occurred even before, probably he was born, which would be after the Persian Wars, with the debate about Athens refortifying the city. Now, Thucydides obviously wouldn't have been an adult at this point. Thucydides is writing way later, but he certainly could have spoken to people who were either very elderly Athenians at that point, or teenagers or young children at that point, and they may have had some type of memory of this. And certainly the rebuilding of Athens does cause early tensions with Sparta, literally just after the Persians have been kicked out of Greece. The tensions between Athens and Sparta are really around the idea that the Spartans don't want Athens rebuilding their walls because it's a sort of a status symbol of Athens' power, but also that the Spartan army wouldn't really be able to hold Athens or squeeze Athens during a siege. And Thucydides in Book 1 tells us about how Athens' growth in power had led to Sparta being incredibly anxious. The Spartans didn't want Athens being used as a base by the Persians, as Thebes had done during the Persian Wars, and very much Sparta wanted to keep Athens weak in Greece. The walls themselves, the refortification of Athens, would absolutely show Athens' power and status and would render any siege pretty impotent. And the role of Themistocles in that is installing the Spartans until the walls, which are put together tremendously quickly, are put in place. Eventually, those walls around the city link Athens to the port of the Piraeus. We can bring in Thucydides here. So Thucydides is really useful because, first of all, he tells us about how he's aiming at an accurate history in 120, 121. Whenever there's a speech that you're using, you can absolutely link Thucydides and what he says in 122 with that particular speech, where he's saying that he's either there or he's used eyewitness accounts that he's tried to check. And certainly, as I said before, in 526, when he talks about how the exile allowed him for looking at views from the Peloponnesian side. So Thucydides, even from the earlier stuff that Thucydides wasn't really, wasn't alive or there for, he will have been able to speak to Peloponnesians and non-Athenians about their views of these events as well. Pausanias causes tensions after the Persian Wars, the Spartan region and his rivalry with Aristides, the Athenian, and the way that Aristides treats the Athenian allies, or rather the Ionian Greeks, well, as a contrast to Pausanias. Thucydides tells us that it's because of Pausanias that the Ionians really want to go onto the Athenian side and want Athenian leadership, and also that Pausanias was potentially plotting with the Persians, and that Sparta sent no more commanders after Pausanias. This is further backed up by Diodorus and Plutarch. Diodorus is useful, though, because he's right in the 1st century BC. He also gives us the idea that, yes, the Ionians wanted to come onto the Athenian side, and Aristides was incredibly influential in persuading the Ionians to sign up to the Delian League, but possibly Sparta was even debating going to war with the Athenians at this point very early on. Plutarch corroborates big chunks of this by certainly saying that Pausanias was harsh, but that Aristides was fair, and this is why the Ionians will seek Athenian leadership and the Spartans don't send out any other commanders. So in terms of the progression of the module and of Athenian-Spartan relations, you can see that in Thucydides' Pentakon to Aetia section, where Athens basically builds up its military force, its wealth. The allies become weaker, Athens is stronger, and you can see that in key events like Naxos and Thasos, and we'll talk about Thasos in a sec. But really, it's very slow for Athens to build up this power. It happens over years and years. It's not a quick moving thing. And is that because the key influence behind the Delian League is the Athenian Cimon? Cimon had a very positive idea towards, or positive views towards Sparta, because he viewed Sparta and Athens as yoke partners. The idea that Athens and Sparta would work together for the benefit of the Greek city-states. So despite Cimon's progressive ideas towards Sparta, Athenian and Spartan relations really do start to deteriorate surrounding the revolt of Thasos and the idea that Sparta would actually come to Thasos' aid. Thasos is that city-state in the north, the island in the north of Greece that revolted after the Battle of Eurymedon, asked Sparta for aid. Sparta agreed to invade Attica, but then couldn't do so because of an earthquake, which triggered a Helot revolt. But the fact that the Spartans had actually agreed to aid Thasos by distracting by the Athenians by invading Attica is important. Cimon, unaware of this, sent Athenian hoplites to aid Sparta, but then embarrassingly these hoplites were sent home. And this is crucial because this really did trigger the decline of Cimon's political position. So Sparta agreeing to help Thasos by invading Attica, Sparta humiliating Athens by sending the hoplites home, really does result in Cimon being ostracized and Pericles becoming the dominant politician. And Pericles certainly had a completely different attitude towards Sparta and the allies and the war against Persia than Cimon. Pericles much more sort of anti-Spartan in his rhetoric, much more viewing of the allies as cash cows rather than as equal partners, and potentially you could argue disinterested in continuing the war against Persia, unlike Cimon. And one of the ways that you can view this is in Pericles' rhetoric and actions in regard to Aegina, the eyesore of the Piraeus. Aegina had actually helped Athens during the Persian Wars. It was not a Delian League member, and it had helped Athens at Salamis. Athens launched a brutal and unprovoked attack on Aegina, which was a Peloponnesian League sympathizer. Now, in addition to the unprovoked assault on Aegina in 458, two allies of Sparta, Megara and Corinth, were in dispute, and this meant that Corinth was seething with Athens because Megara swapped from the Peloponnesian League to Athens. And it was because of this that Thucydides says that the Corinthians bitterly hated Athens. With Megara's defection, the Athenian attack on Aegina really stoking unrest in Athenian-Spartan relations. 457 BC, there's an actual battle at Tanagra, according to Thucydides, where the Spartan forces return and they're attacked by the Athenians themselves. So did Spartan and Athenian tensions cause the Peloponnesian War? Well, we do have that 30 years peace that is signed by both sides. When the Spartan king Pleistonax invades Attica, and Pericles uses bribery to push Pleistonax back. But then we've got that steadily increasing tension. We've got the revolt of Samos in 440, where Sparta supposedly, according to a Corinthian speaker later on, provokes the Samians to revolt. We've got the actual sort of general attitude and rhetoric of the delegates at the debate at Sparta. The Athenians were incredibly provocative and unapologetic, and basically said that the Athenians were doing what they wanted with their allies in the same way as the Spartans did with their allies. Now, Archidamus, the Spartan king, is incredibly cautious at the debate at Sparta, but the Spartan ephor, Sthenelaidas, is the opposite. He's incredibly aggressive and basically says that the way that Athens was treating Peloponnesian allies like Corinth, sympathizers like Megara and Aegina, an attack on those was basically an attack on Sparta. And the fact that Sparta agreed to go to war and voted to go to war, and then that's discussed at the Allied Congress, is important. So basically you do have three areas where Sparta seems to have agreed to go to war prior to the Peloponnesian League deciding. So you've got one in 479 in reaction to Pausanias being sort of kicked out of Ionia. You've got one with Thasos in 465. You've got another one in reaction to the Samian revolt in 440. And then finally, this fourth one of where you've actually got the Spartans voting for war, taking it to the Peloponnesian League at the Allied Congress, and then war actually happening. In regard to attitudes after Pericles' death, well, Cleon and Brasidas are both incredibly aggressive towards each other. Nicias, you could argue, is pretty peaceful in terms of the Peace of Nicias, but that peace treaty is a massive failure, and it's opposed by Athenians like Alcibiades, who are sort of shunned personally by the Spartans. And then we've got all the issue with the Sicilian expedition and Alcibiades as a device to the Spartans. And then we've got Gylippus and Lysander as well. But the key thing when you're discussing some of these events is to be aware that the Spartans do actually ask for peace on a number of occasions. So firstly, once Brasidas conquers or takes over Cleon, one after the assault on Pylos, the Spartans actually offer peace at that point, and they do also offer peace at 2 occasions during the Ionian War, which the Athenians reject. So the important thing is not to get too distracted with the vast material for a question like this, because you've only got 45 minutes. The important thing is for having a structured answer where you're able to discuss the whole time period that you're being asked. You're able to link it to sources, and you're able to discuss how using Thucydides, how using Herodotus, how using some of your other sources like Aristophanes, for instance, are really effective in giving us an idea and a view about the relations between Athens and Sparta.